Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take complex and often daunting topics, immerse ourselves in the source material, the research, the articles, the historical accounts, and extract the essential insights you need to become truly well-informed.
Today's deep dive is, well, it's into history that is challenging, extensive, and incredibly sensitive. We are examining the historical foundations of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
In our sources here, they rely on a critical academic body of work. The frame for this whole discussion is that the decades-long struggle wasn't just a series of border disputes or religious clashes.
No, not at all. It's presented as a relentless, very focused quest for security, but security through dominance. That's the key phrase.
Okay, let's unpack that core analytical premise right away. We are not here to choose sides or,
Yeah.
simply recite a chronology of events.
Right.
Our mission is guided by these critical texts to pull out the key insights concerning how foundational strategic thinking, the pursuit of military dominance, and the long roots of colonialism shaped this conflict.
From the late 19th century, right up through the early 2000s, we are truly looking at the core machinery of the conflict as the sources see it.
And if we accept that premise from the sources, that the goal was never simply survival, but establishing permanent, irreversible superiority, it really changes how you interpret every single event that follows.
It does, from early settlement strategies all the way to the refusal of later peace deals. To start, though, we have to establish the ground rules for the language we're using, especially around the idea of expansion.
Right.
Our source material immediately introduces a crucial conceptual framework, and it's drawing on thinkers like David K. Fieldhouse and Hannah Arendt. This distinction is our nugget one.
And I have to say, as someone who probably used colonialism and imperialism interchangeably before this differentiation was a genuine aha moment for me.
It is for many people.
So what's the fundamental difference they emphasize in the context of Palestine?
Well, Fieldhouse defines colonialism as expansion that's specifically based on the actual needs or interests of the state.
Okay, needs or interests.
Right. And crucially, this involves the permanent settlement of people from one country to another. The intent is to establish societies as similar as possible to the origin society.
So it's about transplanting a society, the kind of replication.
Exactly. And the sources argue this type of expansion is inherently territorial and exclusionary. It often just completely disregards the indigenous people already there.
That makes it sound like a very focused, almost inward-looking project, even though it's happening on someone else's land and displacing them.
That's the key distinction. Arendt, on the other hand, describes imperialism as expansion for expansion's sake.
Pure power.
Pure power accumulation. Every conquest is just a way station to the next. Our sources assert that the establishment of a purely Jewish state in what was then Arab Palestine naturally fit the colonial model.
Because of that need for permanent, replicating settlement among an existing native population.
Precisely. And that type of project, by its very nature, made a long-term violent confrontation almost inevitable, according to this analysis.
We have to anchor this analytical framework in the historical reality of the late 19th century. I think it's vital for you to remember that both Jewish people and Arab people were seeking national liberation at that time.
A crucial point.
We're talking about a full half-century before the tragedy of the Holocaust, which dramatically reshaped global attitudes and, of course, accelerated the project.
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize that Jews were seeking sanctuary from widespread persecution, particularly the pogroms in the Russian Empire.
And at the same time.
Simultaneously, Arabs were seeking liberation and self-determination from the centuries-long oppression of the Ottoman Empire. So you have two national movements, Zionism and Arab nationalism, emerging in parallel.
But when the early Zionist settlers arrived in Palestine, they brought with them something else.
They did. The sources term it the usual European colonialist attitude of contempt and abusive behavior toward the native Palestinian population, and that, right there, set the stage for the conflict to come.
So that initial mindset, which was based on these European expansionist models, that seems to be the critical lens through which we have to interpret the next 50 years.
It is. It's the starting point for everything else.
Okay, so let's delve deeper into the intellectual origins of the project.
The sources are very clear that the primary purpose was, at its heart, existential. It was about rescuing diaspora Jewry from what Theodore Herzl believed was ineluctable anti-Semitism.
Meaning unavoidable and permanent persecution.
Yes, he saw no other way out.
And Herzl, who's acknowledged as the father of political Zionism, he viewed the future state explicitly through this colonial framework, didn't he?
Oh.
Almost as a utility for the existing European powers.
That's exactly right. He envisioned the Jewish state as an outpost of civilization against barbarism.
That's a direct quote.
A direct quote. He was framing it as a beneficial instrument for the major powers. This aligns perfectly with the traditional European rationales that justified colonization.
The idea that it's a moral gift of high civilization to so-called backward peoples.
Precisely. In this view, colonization wasn't just practical. It was presented as an altruistic, civilizing mission.
But the immediate, inescapable contradiction to this vision of a blank slate was what the sources bluntly title the Arab problem.
Right.
This was not empty land. It wasn't a sparsely populated territory by any stretch of the imagination.
We have to look at the demographics of the time. In the late 19th century, Palestine's indigenous population was overwhelmingly Arab. We're talking about 92% of the inhabitants.
Wow, 92%.
And by 1906, out of 700,000 people, only about 5,500 were Jewish.
Wow.
And even within that small Jewish population, only about 550 were actual Zionist pioneers focused on this political project.
So the existence of a substantial, functioning indigenous Arab majority was, by definition, the central issue that had to be resolved if that colonial goal of a purely Jewish state was ever going to be achieved.
It was the fundamental obstacle.
And this leads us to what I think are the most revealing initial insights from the source material. How the founders conceptualized dealing with that indigenous majority. It sounds like the idea of transfer was inherent, not some accident of later wars.
The sources, citing historians like Benny Morris, are very firm on this. They state that the idea of removal or transfer of the Palestinian Arabs was central to Zionist ideology from its very beginning.
And there's documentation of this.
Oh, yes. Specific, often shocking documentation of this intent. For example, in his 1895 diary, Theodor Herzl discussed the necessity of implementing a system to spirit the penniless Arab population across the border.
That phrase, spirit the penniless population, is so chilling. It suggests not just movement, but a kind of calculated disappearance.
It does, and Herzl further stressed that the whole process of expropriation and removal had to be carried out discreetly and circumspectly.
Why? What was the reason for the secrecy?
Because it needed to avoid attracting unwanted attention, specifically from the Ottoman authorities, or later the British, who might object to a policy of open ethnic cleansing. This strategy, this covert planning for demographic removal, was, according to the sources, the template for the future conflict.
So the Zionists then allied themselves permanently with the established European colonial powers, first tacitly and then explicitly with Britain.
Right. And this was against the rising tide of Arab nationalism, which was at the same time demanding self-determination.
That alliance really solidified during the Mandate era after World War I.
It did. The League of Nations Mandate Authority system was, on paper, intended to ready territories for self-government. But the Arabs opposed this. They demanded an independent, democratic parliamentary state which was consistent with the League's own principles of self-determination.
But the Palestinian demand was rejected, and the reason given was because Jews were a minority. That just sounds like a devastating paradox for the Palestinians.
It was a profound structural disadvantage. It's often referred to as a catch-22.
How so?
The British Mandate text insisted on including the Balfour Declaration. This effectively sanctioned the project to turn Palestine into a Jewish state. So the Zionist strategy became explicit. Outnumber the existing population and acquire ownership of most of the land before any self-governing institutions could be established.
So once you achieve majority status and land ownership, then you can start making democratic claims.
Then the democratic claims can be asserted from a position of power. It's a strategy that demanded maximizing immigration, which, as you can imagine, spiked dramatically in the 1930s.
This demographic surge was huge, and it just poured fuel on the fire.
It really did. And the sources are careful to point out that while the rise of Hitler is the standard explanation we all hear,
Right.
Jewish immigrants were increasingly coming from Poland, not just Germany, in the early 30s. Palestinians widely viewed this as Zionists exploiting the tragedy of Nazism for a very specific political and demographic advantage.
And is that view supported by the sources?
It is. It's an observation supported by sources noting the Zionist leadership was determined to wrest political advantage from the tragedy.
That is a cold, calculated strategy of opportunity. It's turning a human catastrophe into political fuel for land acquisition.
It was. And this relentless pursuit of demographic and territorial advantage, it quickly moved toward military expansion. By 1937, David Ben-Gurion had already articulated his strategy.
What was it?
He planned on using the Peel Commission's partition recommendation, which at the time suggested a very small Jewish state, not as a final outcome, but as a crucial tactical stepping stone for military expansion over the whole of Palestine.
And he was open about this.
He was explicit about this intent in his private diaries and communications.
So even a limited international agreement was viewed only as a launchpad for future unilateral expansion.
Absolutely. And the eventual British withdrawal, which set the immediate stage for the 1948 war, was influenced by three critical external factors.
Well, what were they?
First, Britain was just financially exhausted after World War II. Second, they were fighting increasingly effective Jewish terrorist groups, the Irgun, IZL, and LEI. And the sources confirm these groups were often financially supported by the American public, which internationalized the conflict.
And the third factor was pressure from the United States.
Immense pressure. President Truman, in a move that historians widely note as politically motivated to mobilize the Jewish vote, pressed Britain to admit 100,000 more Jewish immigrants.
So by the time the UN gets involved, the whole situation is locked into this Anglo-American geopolitical dynamic.
And it was soon to be further complicated by the Soviet-American Cold War. The British just gave up. They handed the problem to the fledgling UN.
Which brings us directly to the UN Partition Resolution of 1947. The suggestion was to divide Palestine into two independent states.
It was. And the Jewish Agency, consistent with its long-term strategic goals, immediately began pushing the UN for an allotment of 80% of the land.
80%. That clearly exceeded the initial proposal.
By a huge margin. But the sources reveal that the fate of the proposed Palestinian state was already sealed. And not just by these aggressive military and political plans, but by secret diplomacy.
This is Nugget 2. The secret collusion between Ben-Gurion's leadership and King Abdullah of Transjordan.
This claim is one of the most significant and frankly shocking in the source material regarding the 1948 conflict. It fundamentally subverts the widely accepted narrative.
How so?
Ben-Gurion secretly sabotaged the establishment of the Palestinian state through a very cynical agreement with King Abdullah.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of that deal. What exactly did these two parties agree to, hidden from the other Arab nations and from the UN?
It was a quid pro quo deal between the Zionist leadership and Transjordan. Abdullah secured Jewish agreement to annex the populated Arab part of Palestine.
The exact territory the UN had designated for the Palestinian state.
The very same territory. In exchange, Abdullah promised that Transjordan would not challenge the establishment of the Jewish state, and the Jews would not challenge Transjordan's annexation of that Palestinian territory.
So, before the major conflict even erupted, the land that was supposed to be for Palestinian independence was already secretly carved up between Israel and Transjordan, who were supposed to be the protectors of the Arabs.
Precisely. The sources argue this meant the ensuing fighting was strategically necessary only to create the appearance of a war.
The appearance of war. Why?
This was vital to disguise Abdullah's collusion. The other Arab states, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, had to believe that Transjordan was entering Palestine to save the Palestinians, not to annex their land in cooperation with the Zionist project.
That completely recontextualizes the 1948 war. It was not, as it's so often portrayed, a purely desperate defensive struggle against overwhelming unified Arab aggression.
The source material strongly refutes that narrative. Ben-Gurion's operational plan upon declaring statehood was multi-phased.
What were the phases?
First, allow Transjordan to occupy the UN-designated Palestinian land. Then, fight them later, annex that land to Israel, and use the chaos of the war to cleanse Palestinians from all Jewish-held territory.
And the sources indicate Israel quickly breached that secret agreement, pushing the fighting even further.
They did. Israel actively fought Transjordan for territories Abdullah expected to annex. Ben-Gurion's intent, according to the texts, was to smash the Arab Legion and force Abdullah to accept territorial concessions.
So the secret pact was just a temporary tool.
A tool to eliminate the Palestinian state from the equation. The result. Israel rapidly enlarged its territory from the 56% the UN had allotted to 78% of the mandated land.
And the sources back this claim of aggression rather than pure defense with some devastating statistics.
Yes, the source material provides a crucial breakdown of casualties. They point out that most Israeli casualties, 2,759 of them, occurred while invading Palestinian territory.
As opposed to
the 1,581 killed while defending UN-designated Jewish territory. The argument made is that neither Transjordan nor Iraq seriously attempted to invade the UN-designated Jewish territory.
So the conclusion from that data is
The conclusion drawn is that the widely held belief that unified Arab armies threatened Israel's very existence in 1948 is, quote, without foundation.
This expansion then naturally leads us to the question of demographics.
Mm.
What were the means used to achieve that demographic shift? The sources use the very strong term ethnic cleansing.
They do. Historian Alain Papé is cited, arguing that the objective was the ethnic cleansing of the country, and the war was simply the means to carry it out.
And the primary method was what?
The deliberate inducement of panic and mass flight through acts of terror and massacres. These were committed first by Jewish terrorist groups, the Irgun IZL and LEHI, and then later systematized by the newly formed IDF, or Haganah.
The massacre at Deir Yassin is often cited as a turning point in this psychological warfare.
It was horrific. The sources describe the April 1948 massacre at Deir Yassin, committed by the Irgun and LEII, as being carried out with great cruelty, killing up to 254 men, women, and children.
And the effect of that.
The sources cite this event as more than any other single event, responsible for breaking the spirit of the civilian population and setting into motion the mass exodus of Arabs from Palestine.
Now, how do the sources handle the claims that the flight was due to Arab leaders telling people to leave? That's a very common counter-narrative.
They do acknowledge that Arab leadership did issue some calls for evacuation, but they argue that these were disorganized and sporadic compared to the overwhelming systematic effect of the terror.
So the terror was the decisive factor.
According to this analysis, yes. The sources cite internal Israeli documentation confirming this intended effect. By June 1st, just 2 weeks after statehood, 370,000 refugees had fled, primarily due to Jewish military attack or fears of further attack.
And this wasn't an isolated incident.
Not at all. The violence was widespread and systematic. There were at least 20 major massacres, defined as killing more than 50 civilians each, and 100 smaller ones.
That's a staggering number.
It is. And a former director of the Israel Army Archives admitted that, quote, acts were committed which are defined as war crimes, such as murders, massacres, and rapes. Even Ben-Gurion, who publicly denied involvement in Deir Yassin, privately ratified cooperation with the groups responsible just days later.
Which lends credence to the claim that the terror served a strategic purpose.
It does. And the net result of this strategy was the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians.
Okay, so if the 1948 war secured 78% of Palestine and expelled 750,000 Palestinians, what was the strategic outlook moving forward? Did the pursuit of dominance end there?
Far from it. The view from key figures like Moshe Dayan was that the 1948 war was not yet over.
Not yet over.
The strategy hardened into this relentless quest for what they called insuperable military power. The goal was to continually assert military dominance to ensure the Arab states gave up all hope of a second round.
So this required more military operations.
It required Israel to seek further large-scale operations, not only to round off Israel's borders, as they put it, but to maintain a constant psychological superiority.
This really shifts the focus from simple defense to a deliberate, proactive policy of provoking conflict to achieve specific territorial and psychological goals.
Exactly. The strategy, as laid out in the texts, was to provoke weaker Arab states into wars they would inevitably lose.
In order to do what?
To acquire more territory and expel more Palestinians. This played out clearly in the 1956 Suez War. Israel, colluding with Britain and France, attacked Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal.
And while that was condemned internationally by the U.S. and the UN, the context of the Cold War quickly overshadowed the aggression, didn't it?
It did. The U.S. softened its stance when Egypt accepted Soviet arms, which effectively drew Israel into the whole Cold War containment dynamic.
And this is where the sheer ambition of the dominance strategy becomes crystal clear.
It is. The sources mention in extreme detail about Ben-Gurion's territorial ambition during the secret Suvers conference.
Tell us about that plan to recolonize the region.
Ben-Gurion's 1956 plan, which he presented to the French and British, was breathtaking in its scope. It was a proposal to systematically recolonize the whole Middle East, dividing territories among Israel, Britain, and France.
So what did that mean for Israel specifically?
It called for Israel to take the Sinai, southern Lebanon, and all of Palestine. The sources cite this as revealing a massive appetite for territorial expansion and a cavalier attitude toward the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the neighboring Arab states.
That grand vision was ultimately thwarted by international pressure, but the core strategy of provocation continued, leading directly to the Six-Day War in 1967.
Which is often framed purely as a defensive necessity.
But the sources are unequivocal in their assessment of 1967.
They are. They assert that the U.S. knew Israel was under no military threat, but acquiesced to the attack anyway, choosing not to restrain its ally.
And Israel used this opportunity
To colonize the remainder of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, along with Syria's Golan Heights and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, all in violation of the Geneva Conventions governing occupied territories.
How do the sources prove that the threat wasn't existential? What specific evidence do they offer regarding the motivation for the war?
Well, they detail the history of provocations, what they call Dayan's defensive retaliation game.
Explain that game.
Dayan himself admitted that the strategy was to send tractors into off-limits DMZ areas to draw Syrian fire. If the Syrians held their fire, he would just push the tractor further and further until they got annoyed and shot back.
And that single shot would then justify a massive response.
A large-scale military response using artillery and air force, which was then cast as necessary retaliation. Dayan noted that at least 80% of the clashes were started this way.
So it sounds less like defense and more like deliberate engineered baiting to create a pretext for escalation.
That is the source's conclusion. And moreover, this was widely known internally. General Ezer Weizmann agreed there was no threat of destruction in 1967.
Even Menachem Begin, who later became prime minister, admitted it.
He did, publicly. He said, "The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him."
Yet publicly, they were broadcasting belligerent Nasser speeches and warning U.S. President Lyndon Johnson of an impending second Holocaust to justify a preemptive war.
They were, and this brings us to a crucial legal distinction that the sources rely on: preemptive versus preventative war.
Right, this is a critical concept in international relations and this idea of offensive realism.
It is. States often try to rationalize their attacks as preemptive, saying they're anticipating an imminent attack, and they try to distinguish this from an illicit preventative war, where an attack is just considered inevitable but not actually imminent.
But the UN Charter, specifically Article 51, is very strict on this.
Yeah.
Help us break down Article 51 for the listener. What does it actually allow?
Article 51 only allows for self-defense if a state undergoes an immediate armed attack.
An immediate one.
The sources emphasize that even an anticipated imminent attack is not sufficient justification for an unauthorized war, let alone a preventative one where the threat is merely anticipated at some future point. The UN Charter was meant to prohibit unauthorized preemptive wars.
You need authorization from the international community.
You do.
So how do the sources apply this standard to the 1956, 1967, and 1982 conflicts?
They flat out reject the notion of legal self-defense. The sources assert that Israel's allegations that those three wars were preemptive were, quote, without merit.
So the 1967 war, according to this analysis,
was ultimately an act of military hegemony, an extension of the dominance strategy that generals regretted ending too soon back in 1948. It was a calculated move to secure the rest of the land deemed necessary for the project.
This brings us to the more current situation, where the sources characterize Israel as a hegemon in the Middle East. And this status, they argue, is not just due to military size, but to a massive and persistent indifference to international laws and norms.
Right. And they define the mark of the hegemonic offensive realist state by three non-negotiable behaviors.
What are they?
First, massive military expenditure. Israel has spent between 20% and 40% of its budget on security. Second, the evasion of international laws and treaties it views as restricting its freedom of action.
And third,
the continued pursuit of preemptive wars to maintain a decisive power gap. This is all cemented by Israel's huge military force and its sole possession of nuclear weapons in the region.
And this capability for dominance is, of course, deeply intertwined with the support of a global superpower, the United States. The sources describe this as a U.S.-Israel symbiosis.
They argue the U.S. has acted as Israel's guardian, apologist, and strategic partner since 1967. And this partnership grants Israel what the texts call virtual carte blanche regarding its military behavior.
Backed by U.S. diplomatic protection.
Exactly, using its veto power at the UN to provide immunity from almost all UN condemnations.
What were the original and what are the sustained U.S. motivations for this unparalleled level of protection?
Historically, the primary motivations were strategic, ensuring the flow of Middle Eastern oil and, critically, the Cold War containment of the Soviet Union.
And Israel serves as a key partner there.
A key strategic partner with advanced weaponry and bases. Over time, the relationship has become so tight that historians cite a complete identity of Israeli and American interests on many key regional issues. And this often leads to U.S. indifference toward Palestinian suffering under occupation.
You can really see the slow erosion of U.S. foreign policy firmness when you look at the official stance toward Jewish settlement building on occupied land. It's a constant, visible expansion of the original colonial project.
That policy drift is a perfect illustration of this symbiosis. The official U.S. attitude toward the settlements progressively slid from describing them as illegal under President Carter to merely an obstacle to peace under Reagan. Then it softened even further to a complicating factor under Clinton, and finally just a concern under George W. Bush.
So this systematic softening of U.S. condemnation.
The sources argue it directly facilitated the continuous illegal expansion of the colonial project into the occupied territories.
Let's delve into those international law violations. The sources reference the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention, which governs the treatment of civilians in wartime. What are the key violations cited that characterize this dominant strategy?
Well, Israel, according to the sources, consistently ignores prohibitions on several key activities. These include establishing settlements for its own population on occupied lands, which is strictly forbidden.
Okay.
What else? The deportation of inhabitants, collective punishment, like the routine demolition of homes belonging to the families of suspected attackers, imprisonment without charge for prolonged periods, torture, and the confiscation of private land and water resources.
This suggests that security is pursued not through adherence to international law, but through a kind of unfettered autonomy. Military power just dictates the legal reality on the ground.
That is the core conclusion drawn from this analysis. And furthermore, this preference for dominance over accommodation is profoundly illustrated by Israel's refusal of the 2002 and 2007 Arab World Pledge for Final Peace.
Remind us what that pledge offered.
It offered guaranteed security and full recognition of Israel in exchange for withdrawal to the 1967 borders and the establishment of a small Palestinian state.
And the sources imply that the dismissal of this comprehensive offer was a powerful signal that the preference was to retain land and resources rather than to embrace peaceful coexistence and regional balance.
Exactly. Why would you accept guaranteed security from your neighbors if you believe your own dominance and continued control of resources provide a better, more permanent security?
It's a different definition of security.
It is. The source material argues that this action demonstrates a deep-seated belief that military superiority is an end in itself, rather than just a means to achieve peaceful stability.
And that retention of land, as you just mentioned, is inextricably linked to the control of vital resources, specifically water. This brings us to nugget 3, water as a territorial imperative.
It's a huge factor. Yitzhak Rabin is quoted as saying that if every other problem were solved but the water issue remained, the region would explode.
That immediately elevates water from just an environmental consideration to a primary, non-negotiable driver of conflict and territorial acquisition.
It was a long-held objective. Aaron Wolf, a consultant to the U.S. State Department, noted that access to water had at times assumed importance, quote, to more traditional definitions of security. For the early Zionists, control of the headwaters of the Jordan River was a strategic imperative by 1967.
And the land conquered in the 1967 war perfectly satisfied this hydrostrategic need. It was a major military payoff in terms of resource control.
It was, and post-1967, the placement of the settlements directly reflects this. The settlements in the Golan Heights were strategically established to guard the Syrian headwaters.
And in the West Bank.
Crucially, West Bank settlements were deliberately situated directly on top of the most plentiful aquifers. The sources state that territorial negotiations over the return of the Golan Heights and West Bank have failed, not primarily due to military defensive value,
But because of water.
but because of Israel's hydrostrategic territorial imperative.
The military value of the land is temporary. The water beneath it is permanent.
Precisely. And this control manifests in stark, daily examples of inequality. Palestinians are consistently denied well licenses. Meanwhile, Jewish settlements, which strategically tap deep, high-yield wells, cause the shallower Palestinian wells to dry up.
Which devastates Palestinian agriculture and traditional community water sources.
Completely. And the quantitative inequality cited by the sources is severe.
How severe?
It's systematic. Israeli citizens are allocated between 4 to 10 times more water per capita than Palestinians. For instance, Palestinians are often restricted to around 60 liters per person per day, while Israeli citizens receive 274 liters per day or more. The sources describe this effective diversion of shared critical resources as a form of water piracy, essential for sustaining the settlement project and undermining the viability of any future Palestinian state.
Let's connect this strategy of dominance to its architects, specifically Ariel Sharon, who really defined the political landscape in the early 2000s.
Ariel Sharon was, by the source's definition, the most unapologetic practitioner of military force. He was adamantly opposed to a Palestinian state. His goal was to use settlements to fragment Palestinian life and deny them any kind of cohesive political existence.
And his strategy for maintaining dominance was, as the source describes it, brilliantly cynical. It operated on two fronts.
It did. He had a dual strategy regarding resistance, not just crushing it, but sometimes actively encouraging it.
Okay, that sounds paradoxical. Explain strategy two.
Well, strategy one was simple. Crush all Palestinian resistance through brute force to achieve submission. But strategy two was to use force, specifically targeted assassinations and aggressive incursions, to encourage Palestinian terrorism.
To what end? Why would he want to encourage it?
Because it provided him with the necessary political justification, the continued threat of violence, to refuse meaningful negotiations and continue the destruction of the institutional infrastructure needed for a viable Palestinian state.
So military actions were strategically useful, not counterproductive, to his goal of avoiding a political solution.
That is the logic described. Journalist David Grossman observed this pattern. He said, every time there is a decline in violence, Sharon rushes to carry out another targeted liquidation of one or another Palestinian commander, and the fire flares again.
Which allowed Sharon to successfully destroy virtually all the essential supporting institutions of Palestinian national life.
The economy, the civil authority, all while claiming that this devastation was forced upon him by Palestinian terrorism.
This constant pursuit of dominance, driven by these territorial and resource goals, it seems it inevitably doomed the numerous attempts at negotiated peace. Let's look at the failures of the Oslo, Camp David, and Wye River processes.
All of these initiatives ultimately failed because they lacked the necessary concessions for a viable, fully sovereign Palestinian state.
So at Camp David in 2000,
Ehud Barak's offers and the subsequent proposals by President Clinton were just too difficult for Yasser Arafat to accept. Political scientists called it curtailed sovereignty.
what does that mean in practice?
It means even the best offers would have left the Palestinian state geographically non-contiguous and militarily powerless, retaining significant Israeli control over vital resources and borders.
The sources even mentioned an unofficial framework, the Geneva Accords of 2003, which proposed Israeli withdrawal from approximately 98% of occupied territories. Yet even that failed.
It was instantly dismissed by Sharon as subversive. Even when a comprehensive peace framework was crafted outside official channels, proposing significant withdrawal, though still leaving the issue of refugee return largely at Israel's discretion, the dominance mindset rejected it outright.
The pattern is just clear.
The pattern is clear. Military dominance dictates outcomes. Negotiated solutions that offer full, true sovereignty are consistently rejected in favor of retaining control over land and water.
Moving into the more contemporary dynamic, the sources insist on analyzing terrorism broadly. It's defined as the intentional harming of non-combatants for political purposes, and it's applied to both states and non-state groups.
Yes, they frame this as a two-sided war on terrorism.
And this broad definition is crucial for the source material's argument of impartiality.
It is. Non-state terrorism, which often takes the form of suicide bombings, is consistently characterized as the last resort of a desperate and weak people. The texts note that almost all groups that use such tactics globally have an antecedent condition of oppression by foreign occupation.
They're fighting to evict an occupying power from a national homeland.
That's the common thread.
And when we look at the human cost over a generation, the data tells a powerful story about where the overwhelming force is concentrated.
That's right. The data cited from a 20-year period in Israel and Palestine is just sobering. 83% of all civilians killed have been Palestinian, and 91% of children killed have been Palestinian.
So while the sources acknowledge the existence of terror on both sides,
They maintain that state violence retaliation is far greater in magnitude and impact, and it stretches all the way back to the deliberate expulsions of 1948.
and the sources suggest that this state violence is fundamentally counterproductive to the stated security goals.
The argument is that military actions become a hothouse that produces more and more new suicide bombers. The operations breed frustration, hatred, despair, and crucially, a profound desire for revenge.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And the analysis of individual motives for suicide bombers suggests they're complex. It's not solely religious fanaticism, but deep-seated factors like revenge for personal loss, humiliation, and despair.
The sources cite a powerful example regarding motive, don't they?
They do. One captured bomber, who was interviewed by former Defense Minister Ben Eliezer, admitted thinking the religious notion of paradise was stupid.
So what was her motivation?
She was profoundly motivated by revenge, following the killing of her fiancé. This shifts the focus from a purely ideological or religious conflict to one driven by deep personal grievances that stem from military occupation and collective punishment.
Moving from these tactics to the reality on the ground, the sources paint a powerful picture of a society defined by systematic separation and discrimination, often using the term apartheid.
And they distinguish between two forms. Palestinians in the West Bank live under what's termed a hard apartheid, defined by the physical infrastructure of control.
Checkpoints, high barriers, Jews-only roads.
Exactly. Things that fragment their ability to move and exist cohesively.
And what about those Arabs who never fled in 1948, the Arab Israelis, or citizens of Israel?
They live under what the sources term a soft apartheid. This is characterized by political powerlessness, persistent poverty, and institutionalized social and economic discrimination. The most acute example relates to land ownership.
Can you provide the specific details regarding the control of land for Arab Israelis?
This is a critical point. About 94% of Israel remains under the control of institutions like the Jewish National Fund, or JNF, for Jewish use only. This was established by covenant with the government.
So Arab Israelis are legally forbidden from using that land.
They are forbidden to rent, work, or live on this national land. Furthermore, institutions like the Jewish Agency, which are not official government bodies, subsidize Jewish economic development while systematically excluding Arab villages.
Which ensures they remain segregated and chronically underserved.
And it maintains the fundamental colonial premise of separation and dominance.
This institutionalized exclusion leads us to the final debate about the future. The two-state versus the one-state solution.
Right. The two-state solution is still the preferred outcome for a majority of both Palestinians and Israelis. It appeals because it addresses Palestinian national aspirations for sovereignty.
And Israeli demographic anxieties about maintaining a Jewish majority.
Exactly. But the chief practical difficulty remains immense. The necessity of dismantling and relinquishing the Jewish settlements scattered throughout the West Bank to create a viable, contiguous Palestinian state.
And then there's the one-state solution, the democratic ideal, which is favored by some scholars like Tony Judt and Amos Elon. What is their argument beyond the philosophical?
They view it as transforming Israel from a state of all Jews into a secular, truly democratic state of all its citizens.
A state based on citizenship, not ethnicity.
Yes. Legal advisor Michael Tarazi argues that geographically and logistically, the region is already one state. It shares the same electricity grid, infrastructure, and aquifers. The fundamental injustice, he argues, is that the 3 million Christians and Muslims in the occupied territories lack the basic rights enjoyed by the 5 million Jews in Israel proper.
So for proponents of the one-state solution, the cause is no longer just about territory.
No, it's about the deeper ethical imperative of justice and equality.
What's remarkable is the reported moderation from even hardline groups regarding the two-state solution. It suggests a potential off-ramp that has been ignored.
Yes. The sources note that Hamas leadership, including Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, has expressed a willingness to accept a two-state solution within the 1967 borders if it's approved by a Palestinian referendum.
Which would be a de facto recognition of Israel.
It would. But this pragmatic offer has been repeatedly rejected. The sources conclude that if Israel were to simply announce acceptance of a viable and sovereign Palestinian state on the pre-1967 borders, then the Arab-Israel conflict would end, as would Israel's demographic anxieties.
So after all that, we've completed a deep dive into sources that consistently argue that the historical foundations of this conflict lie not in some unavoidable ancient hatreds, but in calculated colonial intent.
An intent that was operationalized through deliberate military strategies to achieve maximum territorial expansion and ethnic homogeneity. And this was followed by a persistent reliance on offensive realism, the pursuit of dominance through superior force, and the systematic evasion of international law.
And central to this entire structure, as we discussed in Nugget 3, was the hydrostrategic territorial imperative. Control of water resources dictated which land was retained, and it fundamentally overrode traditional military and security considerations.
That's the persistent thread. Now, as our sources conclude with a review of ancient history, we come to Nugget 4, challenging the idea that ancestral possession confers modern title.
Right. It seems untenable to build a modern political project on ancient claims when you look at the sheer weight of historical migration and conquest over millennia.
The sources affirm that. 5 millennia of diverse peoples and dynasties, Hyksos, Babylonians, Romans, Arabs, Turks, all laying claim to this land. It defies the assignment of Palestine to any single modern people, even if ancestral lines could be validated.
So the religious and ethnic differences.
They provide the social cohesion and the motivation needed for war, the us versus them. But the underlying conflict, according to this analysis, is primarily about the modern possession of coveted land and resources, not a historical sectarian struggle.
So what does this thorough analysis of strategic dominance leave us with as a final thought for you, the listener? We started with the premise of security through dominance.
The sources suggest that Israel's persistent intransigence regarding a political solution is tied not to a lack of security, but ironically to an excess of security. It's rooted in the belief that superior military power is an end in itself, the very definition of the victorious, offensive, realist state.
So if security isn't the issue, but dominance is the addiction, that creates a profound strategic trap.
It does, and this raises a powerful question about the path forward. What happens if the victor chooses a different metric for stability? What if the goal were not military dominance, but moral and political legitimacy?
What alternative path could that open?
Well, we have to consider it. If the victor were to prioritize moral legitimacy, voluntarily cooperating, ending the occupation, ensuring equal rights, sharing vital resources, would that not secure long-term regional stability more effectively than continual military dominance?
Especially in an era where global interdependence requires cooperation to address issues like terrorism and resource scarcity.
Exactly. The essential challenge for the region remains this tension. Can true, sustainable security be achieved while systematically sacrificing moral and international legitimacy? That is the critical issue for you to mull over.